But we head over now to Turkey, where the incumbent President Erdogan officially won the country's runoff election over the weekend, extending his 2-decade hold on power. He's now expected to rule the country until 2028. Erdogan's runoff win, after falling short of a majority in the first round of the election, prompted huge celebrations among his supporters. His opponent called the election, quote, the most unjust ever, and vowed to keep fighting for democracy. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab is following the story for us from London. Hey there, Imtiaz. So Turkey's Supreme Council the Supreme Council announced yesterday that Erdogan won just over 52% of the votes that have been counted so far. Tell us about his support. Where was it strong? Where was it weak?
Hey, Lana, good to be with you. Well, to answer that question, we really have to understand some of the history and the paradoxes really of the modern Turkish state. You know, when the Ottoman Empire formally ended back in 1922, it was replaced by a secular state that was predominantly Muslim and largely stayed secular until Recep Tayyip Erdogan entered the national stage preaching a different brand of politics, one which religion, Islam specifically, played a role. Now, this was fairly new for most Turks. In fact, I can remember some Turks quietly muttering about the fact that his wife, Emine, wore a headscarf. Now, his AK party is pretty Islamist, it has to be said, and his rise to power and later consolidation of it was also built on this very populist, nationalist narrative that he represented the average Turk, the working class Turk, the ignored Turk, the Muslim Turk, one who for too long had not been listened to by the liberal, secular elites living in big cities like Istanbul. And he positioned himself as someone who could also restore the nation's former prestige and influence around the world when it was still an empire. It's a narrative that is still so persuasive that he's been reelected again after 20 years in power, despite the fact that the economy is not doing really well, and of course that devastating earthquake earlier this year in which 50,000 people were killed. There's a lot of anger at Erdogan, but far more people who still want him in power. Lana.
Yeah, I appreciate the history lesson, Imtiaz. You know, as part of that history lesson, we need to go back to 1952 when Turkey actually joined NATO. That's part of what makes them so important here in the United States. President Biden tweeted congratulations to Erdogan, writing, quote, I look forward to continuing to work together as NATO allies on bilateral issues and shared global challenges. Explain to our viewers what it means for Erdogan to win another term in terms of what's happening with NATO and the country's relationship with the U.S. and our other allies.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and there's a lot to unpack here. You know, Erdogan believes in what's perhaps best described as a, quote, multipolar world, which means he doesn't really buy into a U.S.-led or Western-led world order. And while Turkey is a founding member of NATO, as you so correctly pointed out, Erdogan has forged more of an independent foreign policy from it, one that relies less on Washington and certainly doesn't take any direction from it. In fact, regional analysts say there's always been something of this sort of anti-Western streak within Turkish society, and that Erdogan has found a way to really supercharge it and, of course, energize this very loyal base that he has. As for some of the sort of domestically popular but internationally frowned upon decisions he's taken recently, well, he hasn't followed other NATO allies in sanctioning Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He's also been buying a lot of cheap Russian oil, providing the Kremlin with desperately needed foreign currency. But most significantly, Turkey has also held up Sweden's NATO membership over what Erdogan claims are Sweden's lax policies towards groups that Turkey deems terrorist organizations. And although Erdogan dropped objections to Finland joining the alliance earlier this year, he has not budged on Sweden, demanding that he will keep blocking its bid to join the alliance until it extradites dozens of so-called terrorists residing there. Although Sweden, for its part, claims it doesn't even know who these people are. As for NATO, its leadership really wants Sweden to be a full member by the time of the NATO summit, which is this July. But analysts say the only way that's likely to happen is if the White House sweetens the deal by allowing Turkey to buy F-16s. The Biden administration has signaled it's ready to let Turkey buy the upgraded equipment, but that will, of course, still need Congress to approve it. Whatever the case, when it comes to NATO and the West, Erdogan doesn't seem to want to fully break with them, but it's pretty clear he wants to do things his way.
Well, his way, I also want to dig deeper into something that you said, Imtiaz, because his way includes a cozy relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin that was good for NATO allies in that Turkey helped broker a deal that allowed Ukrainian grain shipments. But what does it mean overall for the war in Ukraine, which really pits the West against Vladimir Putin and Russia?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Lana, and you're absolutely right. He does have these very close ties with Russia and, of course, Vladimir Putin. But Erdogan has also kept in direct communication with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and has repeatedly recognized Ukraine's territorial integrity. And by that, I mean he also recognizes Crimea, which Russia annexed back in 2014. Turkey has also sold the Ukrainian government military hardware, and Ukraine's battlefields have become something of a showcase for the Turkish-made Bayraktar drones. Now, Erdogan, as you mentioned, also helped broker the UN-backed Black Sea grain deal, which has allowed for the transport of Ukrainian grain out of otherwise blockaded ports. All of that puts Turkey in this very unique position, especially if and when Ukraine and Russia get to the point of wanting to engage in any kind of direct or indirect negotiations to end this terrible war. At the same time, Erdogan is sort of sitting on the sidelines of this conflict rather than trying to influence it. And so this is kind of like the good and bad of Erdogan's balancing act here. All of his decisions are not based on what's best for Ukraine or Russia or even the world, but for Turkey. It's all about moves that brings Turkey into prominence. But the risk here is he may be overestimating how much Turkey really, can actually influence global events. Still, Ukraine potentially could be his chance to leave a historical mark if he wants it. Erdogan is already this historical figure in Turkish politics, 20 years in power, another 5-year term. And if he can get Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table and broker an end to this grinding, deadly conflict, well, that would make him a historic figure in international politics too. And that would be quite the crowning achievement after more than 20 years in power for a country which is not one of the most powerful Western capitals, but is certainly on the edge of that. Lana.
Absolutely. Imtiaz, I could go very deep with you. I just want to wish you a Memorial Day. That is fine. Thank you very much.